A German shepherd named Atlas was lying perfectly still in the lobby of the Hartwell Grand Hotel when a front desk manager grabbed his leash and yanked it hard enough to make the dog yelp. Every guest in that lobby turned at once, because the man holding the other end of that leash, a tired-looking father in a faded canvas jacket, didn't shout, he didn't argue. He simply looked down at his dog, then back up at the manager, and said 4 words that made the entire front desk staff go quiet. You don't want to do that. Nobody in that lobby knew who he was. Nobody knew why a scarred old German shepherd had been allowed past the front doors of a 5-star hotel in the first place, or why hotel security seemed almost afraid to get too close to him. They saw a worn-out man in second-hand boots, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and a tired 10-year-old girl gripping his hand. They saw someone who, by every outward appearance, didn't belong in a building with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. What they didn't see was the dog tag still hanging from Atlas's collar, half hidden beneath his fur. They didn't see the faded tattoo on the inside of the man's forearm, the one he always kept covered with long sleeves. And they certainly didn't know that the man standing in front of them, the one being told there was no room available, despite a confirmed reservation in his name, was about to be recognized by someone who had been searching for him for almost 15 years. Within the next 10 minutes, that hotel manager would be escorted out of the building by his own regional director. Within the hour, 3 news vans would be parked outside, and by nightfall, half the country would know the name Daniel Hartfield. Not because of what happened in that lobby, but because of who his father had been, and what that scarred dog at his feet had done to deserve a debt that no hotel chain could ever repay. But to understand why a 5-star hotel chain would end up apologizing on national television, you have to go back to a much smaller, much quieter version of this story. You have to go back to a single dad in a 1-bedroom apartment outside Columbus, Ohio, working double shifts at a hardware store, trying to give his daughter 1 good week of vacation before school started again. A man who had spent his entire adult life trying to forget who his father was, and trying even harder to forget the dog his father never came home to. Daniel Hartfield never wanted attention. He'd spent 15 years actively avoiding it. At 34 years old, he worked the loading dock and the paint counter at a hardware store off Route 33, the kind of job where you came home every night smelling like sawdust and motor oil, your knuckles scraped raw from hauling lumber. He'd been there 6 years. He'd never once been late. He'd never once complained. Not even the week his manager scheduled him for 3 doubles in a row right after his daughter's school called about a fever. His daughter, Maddie, was 10 years old, with her mother's dark curls and her father's quiet, watchful eyes. Maddie's mother had passed away from cancer when Maddie was 6, and since then it had just been the 2 of them, plus one very old, very tired German shepherd named Atlas, who slept at the foot of Maddie's bed every single night without being asked. Daniel didn't talk about the military. He didn't talk about his father. If you asked him directly, he'd change the subject so smoothly you almost wouldn't notice he'd done it. The guys at the hardware store knew him as quiet, reliable Dan, the single dad who brought homemade granola bars to the break room and never missed a shift. None of them knew that his father, Master Chief Robert Hartfield, had been a Navy SEAL who never came home from a deployment 15 years ago. None of them knew that Atlas, the old dog who waited for Daniel in the truck every single day, had once worn a different name and a different collar, and had once belonged to a unit that no longer officially existed on paper. Daniel had inherited Atlas almost by accident. After his father was killed in action, The Navy had quietly informed the family that the K-9 his father's unit had worked alongside, a young, fiercely loyal German Shepherd, was being retired early due to a service injury. There was a small window where surviving family members could request adoption before the dog went into the general retirement pipeline. Daniel's mother, grieving and overwhelmed, had signed the paperwork without fully understanding what she was agreeing to. She told 8-year-old Daniel only that the dog had worked with your father overseas, and that was the entirety of what either of them ever knew. For 15 years, Atlas had simply been a part of the family, a good dog, a protective, watchful, occasionally limping old soul who flinched at fireworks and never barked at strangers, but never let one get too close to Maddie either. Daniel had no idea that Atlas's service record, sealed under a classified designation, told a story that the Navy itself had buried under thick layers of redaction. He had no idea that somewhere out there, a man who once served beside his father had spent over a decade trying to track down exactly where that dog and that family had disappeared to. All Daniel knew was that money was tight. His daughter deserved better than a cramped apartment with a window air conditioner that barely worked. And that this summer, for the first time in years, he had managed to save enough for something special. A real vacation. 3 nights at a hotel with a pool, paid for entirely with overtime hours, and a tax refund he'd been setting aside since February. He'd booked it online 2 months earlier. Confirmation number and everything. A modest room at the Hartfield Grand, a hotel chain he'd chosen specifically because their website advertised that they were pet-friendly for small to medium service and companion animals. Atlas, despite being a German Shepherd well past his prime, only weighed 68 pounds now, thinner than he used to be, his joints stiff with age. Daniel had called ahead twice to confirm the dog would be allowed. Both times, a polite voice on the phone had assured him there would be no issue. He hadn't told Maddie where they were going until the morning they left. He wanted to see her face when she found out there'd be a pool, free breakfast, and a real bed instead of the pull-out couch she usually slept on whenever they visited family. When he finally told her in the truck, she'd let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a shriek. Throwing her arms around Atlas's neck in the back seat, the old dog's tail thumping weakly but happily against the seat cushion. "Is Atlas allowed to swim too?" she'd asked. "I don't know about swim," Daniel had said, smiling for the first time in what felt like weeks. "But I bet they've got a spot outside where he can lay in the sun and judge everybody." It was supposed to be 3 simple days. A break from double shifts, from grief he never talked about, from the quiet weight of being the only parent his daughter had left. He had no idea that those 3 days were about to collide with a piece of his father's past that he had spent his entire life not knowing existed. The trouble started the moment Daniel walked through the revolving doors of the Hartfield Grand with a duffel bag, a tired but excited 10-year-old, and an old German Shepherd walking calmly at his side on a worn leather leash. The lobby was the kind of place that made you instinctively lower your voice. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, a chandelier the size of a small car, and a front desk staffed by employees in crisp navy blazers who looked like they'd been trained to size up a guest's net worth within 4 seconds of eye contact. Daniel, in his faded canvas jacket and work boots, with a duffel bag held together by a safety pin where the zipper had broken, did not pass that test. The man behind the desk was named Curtis Lang, the hotel's evening shift manager, a man in his 40s with slicked back hair and a habit of looking past people rather than at them. He glanced at Daniel, then at Maddie, then down at Atlas, and his expression shifted from professional politeness to something colder. "Can I help you?" Curtis asked, in a tone that suggested he already doubted the answer would be yes. Checking in, Daniel said, sliding his ID and confirmation printout across the desk. Reservation under Hartfield. 3 nights, Curtis typed slowly, deliberately, his eyes flicking back toward Atlas every few seconds. And is that? He gestured vaguely at the dog. A service animal. He's a companion animal, Daniel said evenly. I called ahead twice. Your hotel confirmed pets were allowed. We allow small breeds under our standard pet policy, Curtis said, his voice taking on the particular flatness of someone reciting a rule he'd just invented on the spot. That looks like a fairly large dog. He's old, Daniel said. He doesn't bark, he doesn't jump, and he's never had an accident indoors in his life. I have the confirmation email right here that says pets up to 70 pounds are welcomed. Maddie, sensing the shift in tone, pressed closer to her father's side, her hand finding Atlas's collar out of habit. Curtis exhaled through his nose, the kind of sigh meant to be heard. Let me check with my manager. He didn't go check with anyone. He simply stood there for a long, uncomfortable moment, scrolling through something on his screen that had nothing to do with Daniel's reservation, before looking back up with a tight, performative smile. I'm showing no availability for pet-friendly rooms tonight, Curtis said. I apologize for the inconvenience. Daniel felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. He had spent years practicing exactly this kind of patience, the kind you learn from being underestimated your whole life. I have a confirmation number, he said again, calmly sliding the printout closer. I prepaid for this room 2 months ago. If there's an issue with availability, that's on your end, not mine. A small crowd of guests near the bell desk had started to take notice, the way people always do when they sense a confrontation brewing in a quiet room. A well-dressed older couple paused on their way to the elevator. A bellhop slowed his cart to a stop, pretending to organize luggage tags. Sir, I understand you're frustrated, Curtis said, his voice rising just enough to be heard by the small audience gathering, just enough to make Daniel sound like the unreasonable one. But we can't accommodate large dogs in our lobby area, regardless of reservation status. Hotel policy. Then why does your website say up to 70 pounds? Daniel said, pulling out his phone, scrolling to the page he'd bookmarked weeks ago. Why did 2 separate employees confirm this on the phone before I drove 4 hours to get here with my daughter? Curtis's eyes flicked toward Atlas again, and something in his expression shifted from condescending to something closer to nervous. The dog hadn't moved. He hadn't growled, hadn't barked, hadn't so much as lifted his head off the floor where he lay. But there was something about the stillness of him, the watchful, unblinking calm in his amber eyes, that made Curtis visibly uneasy. I need this leash handled, Curtis said abruptly, reaching across the desk and grabbing the leather strap near Atlas's collar, yanking it sideways as though trying to move the dog out of the walking path. It wasn't a gentle correction. It was a hard, careless jerk, the kind that made the leather bite into the loose skin of an old dog's neck. Atlas let out a sharp, pained yelp, scrambling sideways on the marble floor, his back legs nearly slipping out from under him. The sound cut through the entire lobby like a gunshot. Maddie gasped, dropping instantly to her knees beside her dog, wrapping both arms around his neck. Don't touch him, she said, her voice cracking with a mixture of fear and fury that no 10-year-old should have to summon in a hotel lobby. And that was the moment Daniel stopped being patient. He stepped between his daughter and the front desk, his voice dropping into something low and absolutely controlled, the kind of stillness that, to anyone who had ever served, would have been instantly recognizable as something far more dangerous than yelling. You don't want to do that, Daniel said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't loud. But something in the way he said it made Curtis's hand drop the leash immediately, made the bellhop near the luggage cart freeze entirely, made the well-dressed couple near the elevator stop pretending not to watch, because everyone in that lobby could feel it now. Whatever this man was, he wasn't just an ordinary tired father with an old dog. And whatever this dog was, he wasn't an ordinary pet either. What happened next would have stayed a quiet, ugly footnote in a hotel's customer service file, the kind of complaint that gets a form letter apology and a small refund, if not for what Atlas did the moment Daniel knelt down to check on him. The old German shepherd was trembling, more from the shock of the rough handling than any real injury. His back legs tucked beneath him as Maddie stroked his ears, whispering that everything was okay. Daniel ran his hands gently along Atlas's neck, checking the spot where the leash had pulled too hard, his voice low and soothing in a tone Maddie had heard her whole life, some tone he used during summer thunderstorms or the 4th of July when Atlas's old nerves got the better of him. "You're all right, buddy," Daniel murmured. "I got you." But Atlas wasn't looking at Daniel. He wasn't looking at Maddie either. His head had turned, ears swiveling forward with sudden, sharp attention fixed on something across the lobby that no one else seemed to notice. A man had just stepped out of the hotel's business center, an older gentleman in a charcoal suit, broad-shouldered, despite his graying hair, the kind of bearing that comes from decades of standing at attention. He carried himself like someone who had spent a career giving orders and expecting them followed without question. He had stopped near the concierge desk, apparently waiting on directions to a conference room, when the commotion at the front desk caught his attention. Atlas rose unsteadily to his feet, ignoring Maddie's gentle hand on his collar, and took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward the man in the charcoal suit. "Atlas, heel," Daniel said, automatically, reaching for the leash, but for the first time in years, the old dog didn't obey instantly. He hesitated, half-turned, his nose lifted slightly, drawing in the air the way dogs do when something ancient and familiar reaches them from across a crowded room. The man in the charcoal suit had gone very still. He was staring at Atlas the way you might stare at a ghost. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something far deeper, something that looked almost like grief resurfacing after a long, careful burial. "That dog," the man said slowly, his voice carrying an authority that made the entire lobby quiet down around him without him even raising it. "Where did you get that dog?" It wasn't really a question. It was closer to a demand, though there was nothing harsh in it, only urgency. Daniel straightened, instinctively protective, one hand resting on Atlas's back. "He's mine," Daniel said carefully. "Has been for 15 years. The man took a few measured steps closer, his eyes never leaving Atlas, who had stopped resisting Daniel's grip on the leash, but hadn't taken his own eyes off the stranger either. The dog's tail, normally low and relaxed, had begun to wag slowly, almost cautiously, the way it did on the rare occasions strangers managed to earn his trust within seconds rather than months. "What's his name?" the man asked. His voice quieter now, almost unsteady. "Atlas," Daniel said. "Why?" The man's jaw tightened. He looked down at the dog, and something crossed his face that none of the gathered onlookers, not Curtis behind the desk, not the bellhop, not the well-dressed couple, could quite interpret. It looked like recognition. It looked like a man finding something he had stopped believing he would ever find. 14 years ago, the man said slowly, "I knew this dog by a different name." Maddie looked up sharply from where she still knelt beside Atlas. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest, the particular kind of dread that comes from realizing a conversation is about to reach somewhere you've spent your whole life avoiding. His name was Ranger, the man said. He was a working dog assigned to a SEAL platoon out of Naval Special Warfare Group 2. I know that because I was the one who recommended him for the assignment. The man's eyes lifted from the dog to Daniel's face, scanning it with sudden, intense focus, the way you study a face, trying to place it against an old, half-faded memory. And I knew the man he was partnered with, the man continued, his voice dropping lower, rougher, like something held tightly for a long time was finally cracking loose. Master Chief Robert Hartfield. The name hit the lobby like a held breath finally released. Daniel felt his knees nearly give out. He hadn't heard his father's full rank and name spoken aloud by a stranger in 15 years. Not once. Not since the funeral, where a folded flag had been placed into his mother's, shaking hands while an 8-year-old version of himself stood beside her, not fully understanding why everyone around him was crying. "That was my father," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man in the charcoal suit closed his eyes for a long moment, as if absorbing a blow he had been bracing for without knowing it. When he opened them again, there were tears at the edges that he made no attempt to hide. "My name is Admiral James Calloway," he said, "retired, and I have spent the better part of 14 years trying to find out what happened to this dog after your father died, because nobody, not the Navy, not the records office, not a single soul I asked, could ever tell me where he went." Behind the front desk, Curtis Lang had gone pale, his earlier confidence completely drained out of him. The bellhop had stopped pretending to organize luggage tags entirely, simply staring openly. Now, even the well-dressed couple by the elevator had drifted closer, drawn by the sudden electric tension crackling through what, 10 minutes earlier, had been an ordinary hotel lobby. "Why?" Daniel managed, his voice unsteady. "Why does it matter so much where he went?" Admiral Calloway looked down at Atlas, who had pressed his graying muzzle gently against the older man's knee, the way dogs do when they recognize someone from a part of their life that had been locked away for years. "Because this dog," Calloway said quietly, "saved your father's life once, in a way that very few people were ever told the full truth about. And I made your father a promise, the night before his final deployment, that if anything ever happened to him, I would make sure his family and this dog were taken care of for the rest of their lives." He paused, his eyes flicking briefly toward Curtis, who looked like he very much wished to disappear behind the front desk entirely. "I think it's time I finally kept that promise," Calloway said. "But first, I'd like to understand why a hotel employee just yanked a decorated combat veteran's working dog, hard enough to make him cry out in pain. Stories like this remind us how many quiet acts of sacrifice and loyalty disappear without anyone ever knowing the full truth behind them. That's part of why stories like Robert Hartfield's and the dog who never stopped honoring him deserve to be told before they're lost entirely." Within minutes, the Hartwell Grand's general manager, a composed woman named Renata Cole, had been summoned from her office, alerted by a front desk employee who had gone sheet white with panic the moment she heard the words "admiral" and "lawsuit" used in the same sentence by a guest who clearly had every right to use both. Renata arrived to find her evening shift manager standing rigid behind the desk, Admiral Calloway standing protectively near a visibly shaken father and daughter, and an old German shepherd lying calmly between them, his tail thumping softly against the marble floor every time Calloway glanced down at him. "Admiral Calloway," Renata said carefully, clearly recognizing the name, or at least recognizing that she should be worried about it. "I apologize for whatever confusion has occurred here. Please, let me." "There's no confusion," Calloway said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of command that made Renata's posture straighten involuntarily. Your employee denied a guest with a confirmed, prepaid reservation, lied about your own published pet policy, and then physically mishandled a service-trained military working dog hard enough to injure him in front of his 10-year-old daughter. Renata's eyes moved to Curtis, who suddenly found something fascinating to examine on the surface of the front desk. "I want to be very clear about who is standing in your lobby," Calloway continued, addressing Renata but pitching his voice just loud enough that the small, growing crowd of onlookers could hear every word. "This is Daniel Hartfield. His father was Master Chief Robert Hartfield, a Navy SEAL who died in combat 14 years ago after running directly into enemy fire to pull 2 wounded teammates to safety. The dog at his feet, who your employee just yanked off his feet by the throat, is the same military working dog who was wounded alongside Master Chief Hartfield that night, and who, according to the after-action report I personally reviewed, refused to leave his handler's side even after taking shrapnel himself." A hush fell over the lobby. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade beneath the weight of what Calloway had just said. Daniel stood frozen, his hand resting on Atlas's back, hearing details about his father's final mission that he had never once been told. The Navy had given his mother only the barest outline 14 years ago. Killed in action, line of duty, classified operational details. Nobody had ever told an 8-year-old boy, or the grieving widow raising him, that his father had died running toward danger instead of away from it. Nobody had ever told them that the family dog curled up at the foot of his daughter's bed every night had once bled alongside that same father in his final hours. Maddie looked up at Daniel, her eyes wide and shining. "Dad," she whispered, "is that true? Is that what happened to Grandpa?" Daniel couldn't answer right away. His throat had closed entirely around the weight of 14 years of unanswered questions. Calloway knelt slowly beside Atlas, scratching gently behind the dog's torn left ear, a scar Daniel had always assumed came from some long Argo scuffle with another dog at the shelter, where they'd first picked him up, never once suspecting it had a far more serious origin. "Ranger took 2 pieces of shrapnel that night, protecting your father's position," Calloway said quietly, looking up at Daniel. "He held off an advancing element long enough for the rest of the platoon to fall back and get your father to a medevac chopper. By the time the corpsman reached them, your father had already lost too much blood from his own injuries, but he held on long enough to ask one thing of his platoon chief before he passed." Daniel felt his chest tighten unbearably. What did he ask? "He asked them to make sure Ranger went to his son," Calloway said, "not to a kennel, not to another unit, to you specifically. He said his boy needed to grow up with a piece of him that would never leave." The lobby had gone completely silent, every employee, every guest, every bystander absorbing the weight of what had just been revealed in the middle of an ordinary hotel check-in, gone terribly wrong. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Renata Cole turned to Curtis Lang, her expression hardening into something far colder than embarrassment. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending termination," she said quietly. "Get your things and leave the building." Curtis opened his mouth to protest, glancing around at the gathered crowd as though searching for an ally who would defend him. He found none. Even the bellhop, who had laughed quietly at Daniel's faded jacket and patched duffel bag less than 15 minutes earlier, was staring at him now with open contempt. "I want every employee on this floor in my office within the hour," Renata said, turning back to Daniel and Maddie, her voice softening considerably. "Mr. Hartfield, I am deeply sorry for what just happened to you, your daughter, and your dog. Please, Allow me to personally upgrade your stay to our finest suite, completely complimentary, for as long as you'd like to stay." Daniel shook his head slowly, still trying to absorb everything that had just unfolded in the span of 10 minutes. "I don't want a free room," he said quietly. "I just wanted what I already paid for." "You'll have that," Renata said, "and considerably more, if you'll allow it." But it was Admiral Calloway who stepped forward next, placing a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder, his eyes still glistening with the particular grief of a man who had finally, after 14 years, found the family he'd promised to protect and never managed to locate. "Daniel," Calloway said, "your father saved my life once too, long before that final mission. I owe him a debt that I never got the chance to repay, because by the time I went looking for his family, the trail had gone cold. Nobody could tell me where you and your mother had relocated. Nobody could tell me where Ranger had ended up." He glanced down at Atlas, who had settled calmly against Daniel's leg, watching the two men with the same patient, watchful intelligence he'd shown his entire life, an intelligence Daniel had simply assumed was just good breeding, never once realizing it was the product of years of elite military training. "I'd like the chance to keep my promise now," Calloway said, "properly. Starting with making sure the world knows exactly what kind of man your father was, and exactly what kind of dog has been quietly watching over his family for the last 14 years. What happened over the following days moved faster than Daniel ever could have anticipated. Word of the incident reached a local news producer within hours, initially as a minor story about a hotel mistreating a guest's pet. But once the connection to Master Chief Robert Hartfield's combat record surfaced, and once the Navy's Public Affairs Office confirmed the authenticity of Ranger, now Atlas, as a decorated military working dog who had received a service commendation for actions under fire, the story grew far beyond anything Daniel had imagined. A reporter from the local news station arrived at the hotel the following morning, requesting an interview. Daniel almost said no. He'd spent his entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of attention, deflecting questions about his father, keeping his head down at the hardware store, raising his daughter quietly and privately. But when the reporter gently asked if Maddie might want to say something about her grandfather, a man she'd never had the chance to know, Daniel found himself nodding before he'd fully decided to, sitting beside her father in the same hotel lobby where everything had begun, Atlas resting calmly at her feet. Maddie looked directly into the camera and said something that would be replayed on local news broadcast across 3 different states by the end of that week. "My grandpa died saving people," she said simply. "And his dog has been taking care of us ever since, and we didn't even know it. I think that's the best kind of hero, the kind that keeps protecting you even after they're gone." The interview went further than anyone at the small local station could have predicted. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by 2 national outlets, both drawn less to the hotel's mistreatment of a guest, though that detail certainly fueled outrage online, and more to the deeper story underneath it. A Navy SEAL's final wish, honored quietly and faithfully by a military working dog for 14 years, without a single person outside that small family ever knowing the truth. Admiral Calloway, true to his word, didn't simply make a phone call and disappear back into retirement. He personally reached out to the Navy's working dog program, requesting that Atlas's full service record, much of it still sealed under outdated classification protocols from a different era, be reviewed and properly honored. Within 2 weeks, the Navy confirmed what Calloway had already told Daniel in that lobby. Ranger, military working dog designation R227, had indeed been wounded in the same engagement. that claimed Master Chief Hartfield's life, and had indeed been recommended for a posthumous unit commendation that, due to a clerical oversight during a particularly chaotic transition period in the program's record-keeping, had simply never been finalized. That oversight was corrected within the month. The ceremony took place not at a military base, but back at the same hotel where the entire story had begun, a decision Renata Cole insisted on, partly as an act of genuine restitution and partly, Daniel suspected, because the hotel's public relations team understood exactly what kind of image rehabilitation this represented. He found he didn't mind. Some good, he decided, deserved to grow out of even the ugliest moments. The hotel's grand ballroom, the same building that had nearly sent his family away 2 months earlier, was filled with rows of folding chairs, far more than Daniel had expected for what he'd assumed would be a small, quiet correction of an old paperwork error. Local veterans groups had heard about the story and asked to attend. A handful of Robert Hartfield's old platoon mates, men Daniel had never met, having been too young at the time of his father's death to remember most of his unit, flew in from as far away as California and Virginia. Admiral Calloway stood at the front of the room in his dress uniform, a row of medals catching the light, and called Daniel and Maddie forward. 14 years ago, Calloway began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. Master Chief Robert Hartfield gave his life pulling 2 wounded teammates out of an ambush that should have killed all 3 of them. He did this while critically wounded himself, refusing evacuation until his men were secured. Beside him through every second of that fight was a military working dog who took shrapnel meant for his handler and who held a defensive position alone, wounded until reinforcements arrived. He paused, looking down at Atlas, who sat at perfect attention beside Daniel's chair, his graying muzzle lifted, his amber eyes steady and calm. For reasons that should never have happened, that dog's full record of valor was never properly finalized. Today, that error is corrected. Calloway read the citation aloud, formal language describing actions that Daniel had only learned the broad outline of weeks earlier. Every sentence, adding another piece to a picture of his father he had spent his entire life only partially seeing. When Calloway finished, he knelt down in front of Atlas and gently fastened a small ceremonial medal to the dog's collar, the dog accepting it with the same patient stillness he'd shown his entire life, as though some quiet part of him had simply been waiting 14 years for this moment to finally arrive. Then Calloway turned to Daniel. "Your father asked one thing before he died." Calloway said, his voice unsteady now, the formality of the ceremony briefly cracking under the weight of genuine emotion. He asked that his dog be given to his son. Not because he wanted you to have a pet, Daniel, because he wanted you to have a piece of himself that would keep watching over you the way he no longer could. Daniel felt tears finally break free. 14 years of quiet, controlled grief finally given somewhere to go. "I think it's safe to say," Calloway continued, looking out at the room full of veterans, hotel staff, and local families who had come to witness the moment, "that your father's final wish has been honored every single day for 14 years, whether anyone realized it or not." The room rose to its feet in unison, a slow, spreading wave of applause that built into something Daniel had never experienced in his entire quiet, careful life. Men he had never met. Men who had served beside his father in places Daniel would never fully know the names of, stepped forward one by one to shake his hand, to kneel down and gently scratch behind Atlas's torn left ear, to tell Maddie stories about a grandfather she had never had the chance to meet. Curtis Lang's termination was finalized that same week. Though By then it had become almost a footnote to a much larger story. The Hartwell Grand Hotel chain, in a gesture that surprised even Renata Cole, established a permanent program offering free annual stays to the families of fallen service members, a policy quietly inspired, the company's statement noted, by an incident that reminded us what true hospitality should mean. But for Daniel, none of the medals, none of the news coverage, none of the formal corrections to 14-year-old paperwork mattered nearly as much as something far smaller and far quieter that happened 2 nights after the ceremony. He found Maddie sitting on the floor of their hotel room, the same suite Renata had insisted on upgrading them to, Atlas's graying head resting heavily in her lap as she traced her fingers gently along the new medal clipped to his collar. "Dad," she said softly, not looking up, "do you think Grandpa knows that we found out the truth?" Daniel sat down beside her, resting one hand on Atlas's back, feeling the old dog's steady, contented breathing beneath his palm. "I think," Daniel said quietly, "he's known the whole time. I think that's exactly why he sent this old guy to watch over us." Atlas lifted his head slightly at the sound of Daniel's voice, his tail thumping once, softly, against the carpet, before he settled back down between the 2 people he had spent. 14 quiet, faithful years protecting, finally resting in the recognition that had taken a lifetime to arrive, but had arrived all the same. If you've ever loved a dog who seemed to understand more than anyone gave them credit for, or if this story reminded you of a parent, a grandparent, or a veteran whose sacrifices never got the recognition they deserved, we'd love to hear about them. Some of the most meaningful loyalty in this world is the kind that never asks to be noticed at all, and stories like Daniel's are exactly why we keep looking for them.